4th, the Westdale is reopening. And if you go to the westdale.ca, you can find the entire film schedule there. There are a lot of movies coming out this weekend. And if you are local, please come out and support the Westdale. Also, coming up February 14th, Valentine's Day, Ernst Lubitsch's The Shop Around the Corner, starring James Stewart and many other character actors from the period, will be at the Westdale for our special fundraising evening. So hope that those of you that are local will be able to attend. We're quite looking forward to that one. And but here we are, everybody. Welcome, and glad to see that so many of you could join us tonight. Tonight we're talking about one of my favorite Preston Sturges movies, Sullivan's Travels. But before we get into that, I think what's kind of interesting is that I'd like to talk about the power of comedy. And since this has been our comedy series at the Westdale, I'd like to dive into this a little bit and just consider on a personal note. Now, going back to, of course, 1941, this classic Sullivan's Travels, our protagonist, James L. Sullivan, is a successful director of comedies with titles like Ants and My Plants. I'm surprised no one has remade that. A man who is at a career crossroads and feels like he needs to make a picture with a message, has a breakthrough after really finding trouble and being convicted to 6 years for hard labor on a chain gang. And what Sullivan says in this movie, as he has his epiphany, is that there's a lot to be said for making people laugh. Did you know that that's all that some people have? It isn't much, but it's better than nothing in this cockeyed caravan. And I think any one of us that have made, by some miracle, found ourselves to be born on this beautiful spinning orb cannot experience life without some pain and sorrow. And yet, isn't it wonderful that we have humor as part of our lives? And though humor can be subjective, and I'm curious about, the selections that we have made for this film comedy series and your own interpretations and interests in them. But what I have found in my life is that though it's subjective, it's also a common denominator. We find common ground through humor. And it's something that can bring people from all different walks of life and cultures together. I think it's fascinating with humor that you don't need to speak the same language when it comes to what is funny. A few years ago, I was working in Lisbon when I walked into an exceptionally clean glass door. Evidently, bashing one's face in is as equally funny in Portugal as it is in Canada. But despite my inadequate walking skills serving as comedy fodder internationally, it was and is the movies that I owe a lot of gratitude for finding my way through life with humor, irony, absurdity, and wonderful, wonderful laughter. And I'm really thankful to the Westdale for deciding to bring us together to celebrate comedy. During the talk tonight, I'm really curious to know, I know we can't have like a verbal dialogue, but I'm really curious to know what formed your sense of humor and what are the early films or comics and comedians in film that you experience who influence what you find funny. So please, in the Q&A, there's a little box that says Q&A down there. Throw in your own personal memories or anything that you felt really spoke to you and still speaks to you to this day. If you'll permit me to indulge, I'd like to share with you two of my own. When I was about 6 or 7 in the 1970s, my father woke me up to watch Mel Brooks's Young Frankenstein on television. And as so many of you that probably also experienced the 1970s, home video had yet to break onto the scene yet. And if you happen to see that something was playing on one of those 3 channels that we had, you took the opportunity. And to this day, my dad and I have this wonderful bond around these movies and still refer to some odd ducks that we encounter as Abby someone. And if you know the movie, you know the reference. The other funny people he introduced me to was, and this is the early 80s, probably late 70s, early 80s, when home video was really starting to come into its own. He brought a pile of Marx Brothers films home, and we did a Marx Brothers binge watch with Duck Soup being the one that really sticks out in my mind. And I know that was on Fred's list actually to do and to talk about. So maybe one day we'll be able to watch that in the theater together. But it really kind of instilled a sense of silliness and chaos, all thanks to Groucho, Chico, and Harpo. And a few months ago, I think one of my most recent fond memories of enjoying comedy, Fred did a talk at the Westdale called "The Movies That Matter," And one of those films he screened was Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. And this is a movie, it's over 80 years old. And I don't know if any of you were there for that screening or not, but over 80 years old, and the Tramp's antics are still causing people to bust a gut. It was so great to hear people laughing at that movie. So, in my opinion, comedy is best enjoyed with other people, and the sound of laughter in a cinema is the right kind of infectious. So I'm excited to get back to that experience soon, and I'm excited to hear and see the kinds of thoughts that each of you have. And when I wrap up the talk a little bit later, love to see what your comments and if you have questions about the film or Preston Sturges, I'll do my best to kind of respond and answer as well as I can. So let's get into the movie a little bit. Obviously no stranger to what makes great comedy work was the director of tonight's picture, Preston Sturges. He was born into wealth and had a silver spoon in his mouth, and he spent much of his youth in Europe with his Bohemian mother, where he was applied ample amounts of culture, everything from opera and classical music. He was at the symphony an awful lot, and to ballet, a multitude of art museums. His mother was a patron of the arts and the theater, and they, throughout Europe, were rubbing elbows with artists and poets, aristocrats and eccentrics from far afield, as dancer Isadore Duncan and the English occultist Alexander Crowley, who actually his mother had a love affair with when Sturges was away at boarding school. Actually, it was Sturges's mother that gave Isadora Duncan, the famous dancer and choreographer, this beautiful scarf that would end up being, causing her to meet her demise. So you can see where he might have somewhat of a dark and strange sense of humor that emerges in his films. Being exposed, of course, to all these peculiar characters and absurd situations totally fed his imagination during his young life. And until such time as he was loafing around, and he clearly admits that he was loafing around from one family business to the next, he experienced a burst appendix that would plant him in the hospital for a long period of time. It's not like today where you're in and out, but he was convalescing for a very long time. And it was during this convalescence that he read about playwriting. And so he decided to take all of this life experience of really being a flaneur and an observer of life and watching other people and trying to figure out, how can I maybe craft a story? He was a natural storyteller. He liked to, of course, embellish and kind of spin a yarn. And so what he ended up doing is putting pen to paper, becoming a playwright, a scribe. And so, he kind of, worked around and failed a few projects, but on his third project, he would score Broadway success in September of 1929 with a hit play, Strictly Dishonorable, that would have a run for in excess of 550 shows. And that's all despite the stock market crash. If you remember, fall of 1929 was not a good time, but it was so popular that he made a success out of it, even despite the Depression. Eventually, as was the case with so many playwrights in New York, and I know Fred talked about Ben Hecht last week, there was the call from Hollywood. And there, as Fred pointed out, if you were able to join us last week for His Girl Friday, there was an awful lot of money attached to it. And so Sturges ran to Hollywood, and one of the first early films that he worked on as a screenwriting team, and it was very common, I might mention, I'll just kind of cycle back here, it was very common that when you got assigned to a studio, you were part of a team. You worked in a room, a smoky-filled room with a lot of guys all talking about the story, and some people taking subjects and aspects of the story. And so in this screenwriting team, his first project for Carl Laemmle's Universal Studios was the James Whale project, The Invisible Man, starring Claude Rains. And I'm not exactly sure what he got fired for, but he got fired. And I'm not surprised, because he is the kind of person that really liked to do his own thing, liked to work at his own pace. And so one thing, and Sturges, again, incredibly astute, he noted was that the studio process of employing story teams, as I just mentioned, what would happen is that they would pass their ideas to screenwriters who would then pass their work on to script doctors. And he just thought the whole idea was preposterous. Like, there was this almost mechanized way of writing. And so he gathered that if he could work freelance and develop his own story ideas and also create the dialogue, he could really sell at a premium and cut out all kind of the middle people who meddled in his work. And so many of the stories that he would go on to direct are ones that he had developed years before waiting to sell independently. But the first one that really grabbed major attention was a screenplay for an original story based on his second wife, Eleanor Hutton's grandfather. He's, by the way, the guy who founded Post Cereals. So still hanging around with the wealthy. And the movie was The Power and the Glory, and in which he encountered Spencer Tracy and became quite good friends with Tracy. There are a couple of things about this production that are remarkable in how they would impact the entire studio system and, of course, Sturges's life. One of the original moguls for Fox, producer Jesse Lasky, purchased the screenplay for this film for $17,000 and a take on the profits. And so Sturges claims that this movie made him enemies with studio heads who felt that writers had a certain place and they should stick to it. And his brethren in the film writing world who were scared to death that due to this move, they would be rendered obsolete. The whole idea, why pay a dozen writers to work on a picture when they can pay one? So you do see a shift and a change that occurs in the 1930s, where you start seeing less screenwriting teams and more individual, sometimes one or two, sometimes three screenwriters accredited to a film. The other thing about working on The Power and the Glory and writing freelance is that he had a lot more time on his hands to hang around the set. And so he would observe directors like William K. Howard providing instructions, and he'd see them working with the crew, the cast, and he thought to himself with much relief, I could do this. So he really disliked immensely the misinterpretation and liberties taken with his stories, and he really wanted full control. And so he just, he voraciously absorbed everything that he saw on a film set. I'll give you an example. I can't quite recall the film he was observing, but he was allowed on the set and he was watching them work with a crane and seeing the fact that you could develop movement by having a crane do an over the head shot and then kind of zoom in to an individual person. And he was just amazed at the fact that this is something that one could do, and that in the studio system you had access to all of these filmmaking toys, for lack of a better expression. So he had, of course, one of the things to know about Sturges is that he wrote a ton of stories. And so he had a great supply ready to distribute. And so another screenplay that he had written was called The Great McGinty. And when the powers at Paramount Pictures picked it up, he made them the deal that he would sell it to them for $1 on the condition that he be allowed to direct it. And they agreed. What do they have to lose? And so the film was a huge success. In a sense, really, outside of someone like Chaplin, Sturges was one of the very early writer-directors of the speaking motion picture era, and he sort of paved the way for guys like John Huston and Billy Wilder, who would follow right along not far after with The Maltese Falcon in the early 40s and The Major and the Minor. Due to the great success of McGinty, Sturges worked out a deal with Paramount in which he ultimately would direct some of the finest comedies in history. He did 7 major films in 4 years. It's absolutely incredible. And of course, including 2 of his masterpieces, The Lady Eve, and tonight's film that we're talking about, Sullivan's Travels. Of course, those both came out in 1941. So it's just absolutely remarkable that he had that kind of sort of prolific nature and talent. Sadly about Sturges, and I think some people often kind of compare him to another wunderkind, Orson Welles. At first had carte blanche, was making money, was certainly had a lot of notoriety and incredibly talented. I think certainly Sturges had a little bit more life within the studio system. But he could also be somewhat abrasive. He had a certain element of arrogance to him, and he kind of looked down on lesser talents. And so, I think within at least the executive, he didn't make a lot of friends in that regard. Actors and artists loved working with him, though. He was a lot of fun on set. He was quite enjoyable. He was a bit of a card, loved to tell stories, and he treated people very, very well. I mean, there's very little drama on his sets at all. Keeping in mind, during the early studio era, you had guys like von Cernberg and oh gosh, what's his name? Henry Hathaway. I mean, and later, not in this period, but Preminger. I mean, all of them, the kind of guys that really love to yell at people and kind of debase them. And Sturges wasn't like that. He had a very steady set. He liked to ensure that people felt calm and comfortable, and there could be a playful atmosphere. But later, unfortunately, he had a couple of films that didn't work out so well for him. And this kind of industry is not very forgiving when it comes to failure. And it gave some of those executives that excuse to kind of cut him loose. He still continued to make films beyond this like verdant period from 39 to 44. But he also, was starting to do play screens for television. He was still working for writing as a playwright to get things on the stage. But unfortunately, he didn't get as much of the notoriety or the longevity that some of his contemporaries may have. And we're going to talk about some of the things, some of the behavior that we see that may have caused some to maybe, put their nose up to Sturges as we start to dive into the film. Excuse me. I do also just want to mention, if I get a little blotchy or if there's any technical difficulty, we've had a slight internet challenge today. So if anything happens, don't anybody panic. I will do my best to get back here, but I just wanted to give everybody the heads up in case I happen to disappear. I wasn't abducted or anything by aliens. All right, let's talk about the film and some of the casting. Of course, what is a great film like Sullivan's Travel if it doesn't have a great cast? And so one of the guys that Sturges had in mind right from the get-go, had seen him in movies like The Most Dangerous Game and Alfred Hitchcock's Foreign Correspondent, was Joel McCrea. McCrea began his career in 1929 in a movie called The Jazz Age, and he would go on to be a leading man in 80 films, which is pretty remarkable. And yet, and his career spanned nearly 50 years. He was in the business for about 47 years before he decided, you know what, I've made an awful lot of movies, 120 plus films, and I think it's time for me to bow out. And though he's well known for Sullivan's Travels, and he appears in Sturges's Palm Beach Story from 1942, which I highly recommend. Get out there and get a copy of that if you can. McCrea had an almost painful humbleness about his abilities as an actor. What I love about him is that I always feel like he feels like a real person. Even when, like if you see Hitchcock's Foreign Correspondent and he's chasing spies and these are like incredible experiences and situations, I really he's believable. He's relatable, I find. He is an everyman that we hear written about, and yet he really doesn't get as much recognition. Even Katharine Hepburn, who was a friend of his, and his wife Frances D, who he's married to his entire life, 50 plus years, she really came out and said, "You're as good as Spencer Tracy, you're as good as Gary Cooper, and yet, unfortunately, people just don't know you as well as they absolutely should." And as a matter of fact, he used to joke about the fact that he got some great roles. He was very proud of his work, but when he commented on getting the role of this character, James L. Sullivan, he's reflecting on Capra and the role of Meet John Doe for Gary Cooper, and he thought, wow, God, this is the kind of thing that someone writes for Gary Cooper, and I should know, because normally I get his number twos when he passes on a film, and that's very true. Most of the films that came his way are because Gary Cooper passed on them. But McCrea was one of those guys who, though he had this incredible career and worked a long time, steady. He had other interests. He was an outdoorsman who had once listed his occupation as rancher and his hobby as acting. And he had received advice early in his career buy real estate. And so in the very early 30s, he did just that. He bought a rather large ranch, and he would continue to buy real estate in Ventura region of California. And by the end of the 1940s, in addition, of course, to his film career, he was a multimillionaire. And in fact, he had a ranch that produced some of the largest beef production on the West Coast throughout, 50s, 60s, 70s. But it's, in this point in his career in the late 1940s, that he started to transition into almost solely Westerns. And so this is what Joel McCrea is known for, is a cowboy. And despite those early, more glamorous roles that he had, he saw himself in these cowboy roles. There's an interview which he was quoted in the late 1970s, in which he says, "I like doing comedies, but as I got older, I was better suited to do Westerns. Because I think it becomes unattractive for an older fellow trying to look young, falling in love with attractive girls in those kinds of situations. I always felt so much more comfortable in the Western. The minute I got on a horse and I got my hat and a pair of boots on, I felt easier. I didn't feel like I was an actor anymore. I just felt like I was the guy out there doing it." And so a little more to come on McCrea, but he, probably was a very imposing figure, standing, gosh, what was he, 6'4.5" or something like that? I mean, so he was quite an imposing figure on the stage and on the screen, of course, more accurately. But then switching to his co-star, Veronica Lake, who was cast in the role of the girl. She doesn't actually have a name in the film. Her name's the girl. She was born in Brooklyn 100 years ago this year. It's 1922 is her centenary, or 2022 is her centenary year. She's born in Brooklyn under the name Constance Ockelman. Her father died at a very young age, and so she ended up taking on the name Constance Keene. Family traveled around all over the place, upper state New York to Montreal, where she lived for a period of time. She even falsely claimed that she went to school at McGill University to become a surgeon. And ended up retracting that. She ended up actually apologizing to the dean of McGill University, saying, I have a tendency to sort of fabricate my life. But finally, she was working and going to school in Tampa, or excuse me, Miami, and she got on the stage and had a sort of a proficiency and a talent for stage acting. And her mother was told that she has a real gift for this, and she has, obviously she is the beauty that the screen appreciates, but she did have some talents and it's real presence. So her mother and stepfather uprooted from Florida and off to Beverly Hills. They ended up in 1938. Veronica Lake kind of resented this in a way and had a really tempestuous relationship with her mother, apparently. And I mean, there's some stories that kind of go back and forth on whether this is actually true or not. But Veronica Lake's mother had written a memoir and claimed that Veronica had been diagnosed with schizophrenia when she was young, and that one of the reasons, and her mother, claimed that one of the reasons they went to Hollywood was not to seek fame and fortune on the back of her daughter, but that it was a therapeutic pursuit to help her with this disease. So, but of course, others claim that this is all false. Veronica Lake said that there was no accuracy to this story whatsoever. However, she gets to Beverly Hills, she gets to Hollywood in 1938, and she's taking acting lessons there, and through the studio system. They had schools there. And she wouldn't be in Hollywood for long before she was cast in an uncredited role as a co-ed in the film Sorority House in 1939, and would appear in several films, uncredited, and until 2 years later, would star in a movie called I Wanted Wings for Paramount Pictures, in which she was asked to change her name from Constance Keene to something that was a bit more relatable to the screen and to the audience. And of course, I'm always fascinated at how people change their names. But the producer, Arthur Hornblow Jr., Oddly enough, a fascinating name of his own kind. Uh, you know, recommended Veronica. He thought it was a very, traditional, strong name, but he gave her the last name Lake because of the quote unquote coolness one feels when they look into your eyes. So Veronica Lake was not thrilled of having to be named. So you can already start seeing, in her autobiography, she talks about how she was already all feeling like she was being passed around, like she was, there's really had no control over herself. And as a result, it caused her to become somewhat of a rebellious spirit. And I think because of this and not wanting to always play the game, it got her labeled as being somewhat difficult. So more about that in a moment. But now she's under contract. Lake was assigned to two more roles in 1941, Hold Back the Dawn, and of course, tonight's movie, Sullivan's Travels. During publicity photos, and most of you may relate to Veronica Lake, if you're wondering if you've ever wondered who she is or if she's recognizable to you, during the publicity photos, her she kind of got this accidental moniker because and she became famous for it when her wispy blonde locks kept covering up her right eye. And the media, of course, spurned on by the producer Arthur Hornblow, because he realized, if we can get some kind of label attached to her, then this movie's going to be big. The media, they dubbed it the Peekaboo Girl. And the peekaboo look. And then, as a result, it influenced hairdos all through the 1940s. And even, we come up to date, contemporary films like 1988's animated feature, Who Framed Roger Rabbit. There, if you remember the character Jessica Rabbit, the hairstyle was adapted from Veronica Lake. And then Kim Basinger, who was in the film LA Confidential, and she won her Oscar for that role, as basically, was being a Veronica Lake lookalike, because she's a prostitute who says, I'm the people who want to spend the night with Veronica Lake. I'm not that person. So definitely always called back to, constantly referred to. And though she didn't make a load of movies, she had a fairly short career. She's fairly well known, and to this day is still remarked as being one of those individuals that we call back to in the 1940s. Here's an image, by the way, that I thought it would be kind of fun to incorporate. After the U.S. entered the war in December of 1941 and into 1942, of course, her hairstyle was so famous and had really caught on. The U.S. government became very concerned that Lake's influential hairdo could cause problems for the women entering the workforce in munitions factories, as there were reported hair-associated accidents. So as a result, Lake was put to work to persuade women to wear their hair up while doing their part for the war effort. She did that on radio and, of course, in these kinds of, publicity stills and short films prior to the feature films, excuse me. In the early 40s, Lake had a really successful career. She was in many films, including This Gun for Hire. She kind of got associated for a period of time in film noir, but This Gun for Hire, starring alongside Alan Ladd, and later in 46, The Black Dahlia, they're both great film noir examples. However, over the same period of time, alcoholism became problematic for her, and certainly had a contribution to some of the on-set behavior. Eventually, she got tired of Hollywood. She ended up leaving Hollywood. I mean, literally left it by flying from her own plane from Los Angeles to New York, just to get away from a place that she wrote later that she thought was going to kill her. As I pointed out previously, Lake didn't want to play the game, and she was always proud that she got out on her own terms. She's quoted as saying, I wasn't a sex symbol, I was a sex zombie. She really felt like she was put into places and experiences that were not for her, and she was far too independent and too spirited. So she left everything behind, and She did turn to television. She did a lot of panel and variety shows in the 1950s. She turns up quite a lot. But ultimately, she started to disappear from the public eye. Sometime in the 1960s, a reporter discovered her working as a waitress in a diner in New York. And though some kind of think, oh, that's really sad, she's falling from grace like that. But she claims that she chose to do this, that she probably could have gone and had a television career, gone back to Hollywood anytime she wanted to. But she just enjoyed this sort of quiet, simple existence. At least that's her perspective. She would return to stage later for a period, but not to be on a downer note, she did die in 1973 at the age of 50, and some of that is due to the alcoholism that sort of ravaged her body. But yeah, so to this day, I mean, she stands out. She was not the first person that Sturges had in mind for the role of the girl. He had Barbara Stanwyck in mind, who he had worked with on The Lady Eve, and he really had her in his mind, but apparently she was far too occupied. The other person that did was Frances Farmer, who also tried out for the role, but it did fall to Veronica Lake. And in my mind, I think it's suitable for her. I think she was incredibly charming in the film, and she has a sort of playfulness about her, and I just tend to think that she works well, and I can't think of anybody else in this role but Veronica Lake. And here's a production still working on the film. Of course, this is the point where McCrea is starting to come down with this cold. But as I mentioned previously, Sturges tried to keep the set very light. And he writes about Sturges. He felt that they had a wonderful working relationship, and that according to McCrea, he enjoyed himself so much that he said, I would have given the money all back. I would have done it all for nothing. He was that easy to work with, and he never put pressure on us. Not only not on me, but not on some little guy who some directors use as patsies, putting the pressure on for some reason that we don't know. So he was just very kind to others. Sturges did put the pressure on some others, like I think Eddie Bracken in movies like The Miracle of Morgan's Creek. So he could take his frustration out on other individuals on occasion, but would always go behind the scenes and say, "Listen, I was doing that to, at least put a little bit of pressure on people to kind of get going and get their gears going here. I don't mean any of that personally to you whatsoever, but I figured you're the one person that might be able to handle that." So kind of bizarre behavior, but always trying to make up afterwards. McCrea and Lake, on the other hand, were a different issue. And despite the charm, the chemistry that the two have together, McCrea did not get along with her, and he claimed that he would never work with her again. And it kind of sort of took him out of a role. There's a movie called I Married a Witch, directed by René Clair, that Sturges ended up producing, that has Veronica Lake in it. It's a great movie. I certainly recommend it. Ended up starring Frederick March. March didn't like working with her either, but she wasn't so kind to Frederick March either. She thought he was a real bore, and they have a love scene together in that film. And she says rather unkindly to Frederick March that if he had anything down there to speak of, she says, under the covers, I would have let him have it. So, anyway. But on top of this, something to be aware of was that Lake wasn't being entirely truthful when she took the role of the film. She was actually 6 months pregnant when filming started, and she didn't tell Sturges. In fact, she told Sturges's wife Louise that she was expecting, and but that she would hope that they could keep it from Preston Sturges. But of course, it obviously had to come out, and so Sturges was quite upset with the fact that she wasn't upfront, wasn't honest with him from the get-go. So what this caused was, and I'm wondering if you go back to watch the movie, whether or not you can notice anything, but they film the filming goes on for nearly 2 months. So by the time the movie wraps up filming, principal photography, she's 8 months pregnant nearly. So to hide this fact, the famous costume designer Edith Head, who we've talked about many times in these talks, who oversaw the costumes in this film, she created outfits and gowns to hide this baby bump. However, eventually it was so apparent by the 8-month mark that they had to do other things. Like, first of all, throughout the film, you can see when they're roughhousing, and we don't see Lake's face. That's because we have a double that they incorporated, and of course there are many scenes where Veronica Lake is either wearing a robe or she's wearing this the rather large clothing of the hobo, which of course was part of the character, but they also get her to start sitting down and standing behind people and standing behind desks a little bit later on in the shoot that you might notice. Yeah, so another point I wanted to point out about Sturges as well. The other reason why he was so successful early on is that he experimented a lot, and he tried to find ways to challenge himself and his crew to figure out how can we shoot faster, how can we move through things quicker, and he had kind of a twofold process around this. Jonathan Seitz, the cinematographer, he kind of dared Sturges to see whether or not he could film 2 days of shooting into one day. And so Sturges, got the crew together and kind of said, let's do this. Let's see if we can make this happen. And so there are times in the film where you will see these absolute long shots. There are a couple reasons for it. They're particularly early in the film between the two producers. There's a couple reasons for it. Sturges wanted full control over his films. So if he could do everything in a long shot and not have a whole lot of coverage, meaning additional shots, it would give the guys in the bean counter less ability to cut. It's very hard to cut when you have an extended 1.5 minute long shot. And there are times I think you can see the character actor Robert Warwick kind of smudge his lines up a little bit, but they just keep on going. But they kind of pushed everybody, and they were able to get 2 full days of shooting in within a 1 day period. And what this kind of also allowed Sturges to do was to have a little more of that control that he loved and he craved and he needed to be creative, because the studio heads were looking at him and saying, oh, well, okay, well, this is going to come under budget. This is going to be great. So we'll leave him alone if this is how he's going to shoot. What happens, of course, though, is that they do go over budget by, gosh, I'm trying to remember. I think it's something like $76,000. They were budgeted at $600,000 for the period, and they went, significantly about 7 or 8 days over schedule, which is a significant amount. So if you recall in the film, there is a whole silent montage where they're in a soup kitchen, and there's a sort of a wide shot of all of these individuals sleeping amongst one another. Well, to try to get that shot, absolutely perfect, as well as some of those other silent montages, that's what caused him to go over schedule, and just to try to get it as perfect as he possibly could. And having that many people in the shots, and there's bound to be some screw ups, he had to continually keep going back and reshooting. So let's keep on talking about our cast. And I would be remiss to not mention, of course, this stock repertory company of character actors that Preston Sturges worked with time and time again. And I've got it just down to one slide just as a representation, but this is just the tip of the iceberg for this movie. And for those of you that have watched a lot of these Sturges films, you probably were watching Sullivan's Travels and going, I know that guy, I know that guy, I know that lady. She comes up in everything. Esther Howard is probably the person I'm talking about, who plays the widow at some point. So all of these character actors who I adore, for some reason, despite the zaniness and the wonderful scripts that Sturges scribes for his performers, I love coming back for the character actors. And, I'm not the only one that has expressed this, but there's this sort of genius in the way that he casts. And he kind of has this eye for casting the same actors in similar roles over and over, despite the stories being quite different. But what it does is it creates a really unique comfort in these movies. It's as though you're seeing old friends. I mean, albeit insane friends, but it's on terra firma, meaning we recognize these stock characters. We know that they have a role to play, and it makes it a little fun because they're just a little bit over the top, whereas our principal characters kind of keep things somewhat grounded. The casting decisions are just so purposeful, as it's like developing precise art direction and production design. I mean, the faces that you see, and I'll call it some of these guys in a moment, are just, they're so unique, and they strike a tone that creates a very distinct atmosphere to what I call the Sturges verse. It's like he has this world that he lives in, and these people continue to come in and out of it. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I can't help but think that he was absolutely influenced by what he was seeing and the people he was spending time with while he was in European exile. A few of these folks that I want to make sure we have an opportunity quickly just to pay some respect for. On our left-hand side, you see Robert Warwick, who plays producer Mr. Lebrand. And on the very far right, who plays the other producer, Mr. Hadrian, is the cigar-chomping, disgruntled partner, Porter Hall. And you see, I don't know how many cigars that he chewed, but Porter Hall constantly, played these sort of, high-strung characters in the films. Perched in the middle here, though, to Porter Hall's right is one of my favorite prissy and snooty character actors, is Franklin Pangborn, and I got to tell you, no one wears a pince-nez and arguably like Franklin Pangborn, and arguably he influenced director John Waters' trademark mustache. He always had that very fine, manicured, and cultivated mustache, and the character you see in this movie, he's, I think he's a newspaperman, kind of an editor of a newspaper, or, like something like Spy Magazine. But I mean, you see him in all these movies. He plays hotel clerks constantly, and he's never very impressed with anybody that he has to come into contact with or serve. And then, of course, the guy to his right is William Demarest. And I mean, for those of you that grew up watching syndicated television, you'll remember him as the sort of housekeeper on My Three Sons with Fred McMurray. But William Demarest is in, I think, almost every Preston Sturges movie, and he plays the same guy all the time. He's always the curmudgeonly, disgruntled, angry, second banana to most of the lead characters. I love him, and he's in the foil to Henry Fonda and the Lady Eve, who is trying to figure out and get to the bottom of the mystery of who these women are that are trying to steal Henry Fonda's heart. But if I could inspire you, if you want to see him in a fantastic role, it's in The Miracle of Morgan's Creek. In which his daughter sort of magically ends up, she's pregnant, and so he's the marshal of the town, and they're trying to figure out all of this strangeness, and he's wonderful, constantly upset and angry, and but not only does Sturges generously give him the best lines in the movie, but he also has a real ability for physical humor as well. So I just can't say enough about William Demarest. I just absolutely adore his role, and all you have to do is see the facial expressions. He just is never a happy looking character. On the right, really briefly, we have, if you go all through the 1930s, you will have seen one or the other of these guys. And if you're looking at the picture on the left is Robert Grieg, and on our right is Eric Blore. And Robert Grieg was an Australian immigrant who made an entire career out of playing valets and butlers. In this movie, he plays the unshakable and morally superior Burroughs to Blore's eye-rolling and hissing valet. And that's, Blore always played these kind of over the top, eye rolling characters who are always conniving and trying to, find an angle, or often, he was the type of guy that was always snitching on people. And, you see him in films like Swing Time and Top Hat, and, often a foil to Fred Astaire, but he has these wonderful scenes in I think it's Top Hat with Edward Everett Horton, who's another character actor I highly recommend seeking out. So these guys, there's a tapestry throughout all of these films that make them fun and interesting, and just I don't know what else to say about them other than I think I can't think of Sturges without these guys. And of course, later on, you see Al Bridge as the chain gang boss, who was actually kind of scary in the role. And then there's Jimmy Conlon, who kind of plays the elderly gentleman who's trying to help out Sullivan and help him get through this prison term. And of course, you see those guys in all of these films as well. And sometimes they can play just bit roles where they show up for a second, and other times they have a fairly meaty role, as Al Bridge did in this one. So with that said, I know we're kind of coming up on our hour, so I just want to briefly touch on what is this movie about, and where does it kind of lie in the pantheon of Sturges's films. The film was the result of an urge, and he writes in his autobiography, Preston Sturges writes, and I quote, "The result was an urge to tell some of my fellow film wrights that they were getting a little too deep dish and to leave the preaching to the preachers. Sullivan's Travels could really have been a little pamphlet that I sent around privately to people." Leading up to Sullivan's Travels, there were multiple prestige pictures with a message from other studios, like I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, directed by Mervyn LeRoy, in early 30s, Paul Muni. But a little more recently is you've got films like The Grapes of Wrath, that is adapted by the Steinbeck novel by John Ford. Not that Ford was really necessarily ever considered, a comedic director, but he really dug in with this message picture that depicts the lives of the poor and transient during the height of the Depression era Dust Bowl. And of course, Frank Capra, whose romantic comedy It Happened One Night won Best Picture, maybe getting this one wrong, guys, so you can call me out on it. Maybe it's 1934 or 36. But it made him one of the kings of comedy in Hollywood. And yet, in a couple of years, he would kind of transition and start making these message movies like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And so, it's worth noting that, of all of Sturges's films, he kind of tells stories about everyday people in really peculiar situations. But this is the only movie that he made that was about a film director. So, it's possible that this is really Sullivan kind of poking fun at his fellow directors, but maybe as we see some of these plot points emerge, maybe he was also kind of, avoiding the draw to try to do something entirely different. It's also worth noting that it's a bit prescient, because as in later years, directors of comedies like George Stevens, who would come back from chronicling the war. Stevens was at, the concentration camps. He's one of the first people to film the atrocities there. He did all these wonderful 1930s glamour films and glamour comedies. He came back and said, I can't make movies, like these comedies any longer. So, he made those sort of light romantic comedies with Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn. He said, I just can't go back to doing that after what I've experienced. So Sturges, of course, he decides to write an original screenplay that pokes fun at anyone who decides to create a message movie. Well, what I love is he's tussling the hair of the Hollywood film machine. Sullivan says, and I quote, "I want this picture to be a commentary on modern conditions, stark realism, the problems that confront the average man," to which LeBrand says, "but with a little sex." And so, there's this need to always have to cater to the audience's needs. And so he's all of this is almost like breaking the fourth wall and looking at the audience and saying, I know what I'm doing. And as a matter of fact, it's arguable, like he obviously in the recent scenes after this, he's absolutely incorporating a little sex with Veronica Lake's character entering the fray, although she becomes sexless as the movie progresses. She's playing a young boyish character. But what I find interesting here is that traditionally, in this particular scene, It's the film executives who are normally made to look like the idiots, but instead, in this case, Sturges decides to put the pressure on the director. This director is Sullivan's got this cushy life, and up to now, he's never really had to do a lot of hard work. Whereas both character Porter Hall and Robert Warwick's characters, they say things like people always like something they know nothing about, and they start dressing Sullivan down as to illustrate that he really doesn't know how good he has it, and that he really shouldn't try to go outside of the realm and just stick to doing what he knows. And so really, the director obviously is out of his league in trying to do this sort of noble endeavor. And ultimately, I mean, I think in today's parlance, one would argue that there's almost a strange, appropriation. Not that one appropriates the poverty-stricken, but it is this sort of this caricature that he ends up playing. Here's an image from the scene, and by the way, I mean, there's a sort of meta thing going on with Sturges, in which he's being overt about showing us that we're on a set. This clearly, when he's walking along in this scene, he wants people to realize that I'm making a pretend movie here right now. And so he, the pretense begins at the objections of Sullivan's butler Burroughs, who says, "I've never been sympathetic to the caricaturing of the poor and needy, sir. The poor know all about poverty, and only the morbid rich would find the topic glamorous." So Sullivan goes and, uses a studio. He gets a hobo costume that's perfectly torn and stained clothes, and he embarks with 10 cents in his pocket in a series of events that show the audience how ridiculous the pretense is. But it isn't just Sullivan who's on a journey. Sturges as a filmmaker is too in this movie. And so I'm going to show a few slides that kind of represent the fact that throughout the film, Sturges has decided to tell the story of Sullivan's travel through multiple film genre. And curious if anyone has any comments as to why you think he took this approach, other than I think he's taken an opportunity to kind of satirize and parody many film genre, but I mean, just to point it out, and I find it fascinating that he's so ambitious to try to do this. He goes everywhere from like the silent Hal Roach style slapstick comedy, if you remember the bus scene where he's in the little tank with a kid, and in fact, even in that moment, Sturges, who by the way really just wanted people to get along, and he thought that everybody was entitled to a good life and to be treated equally. If you remember in this scene, he incorporates a tongue-in-cheek moment in which the African-American cook is depicted in whiteface, and this is definitely Sturges snubbing his nose at those who still thought blackface was an acceptable method of comedy, which at this point it wasn't. It was definitely out of favor, but it's not so long ago that you've got people like Fred Astaire in Swing Time who thinks that, hey, I can do blackface and represent this great talent, Mr. Bojangles and Bill Robinson. And Sturges just thought it was just so ridiculous. He had that perspective spending time in Europe that people didn't necessarily behave this way in places like Paris, and that he could have dinner at the same table in a nightclub with someone of color, and then it was not a big deal. So I mean, he was really just trying to snub his nose at that part of the establishment. But you see that fun bus chase and people falling all over the place, and it's just a calamity. So that's one example. Screwball comedy, of course, this has got elements of the screwball comedy in it. And this is multiple examples from wearing the widower's suit and, walking into the widow's, played by Esther Howard, into her bedroom, and she's, blinking her eyes at him. It's like a French farce, right to the downright surreal. And, the painting or the portrait of her dead husband, whose face constantly is disapproving and is changing facial expressions. I mean, this is not a movie that is meant to be realistic. And then of course the famous pool scene in which Sullivan and Lake, or the girl, fall into the pool, and they take the butler and the valet with them. Of course, we all know that's a trope that stands the test of time. We're still seeing this happen in contemporary films. There's always somebody falling into the pool. So there's those screwball elements that exist throughout the movie. But then there's also the love story, the romantic comedy element, and there's this, though I mean, it doesn't kind of pursue it too terribly, but there's an intimacy displayed between the two lead actors. But there's a slightly at the beginning anyway, a slightly different dynamic that he's trying to incorporate here, in which the woman's buying the guy the food. Lake's character even says, and so nice to be able to buy a man food for a change, so and I don't have to feel forced to listen or laugh at his jokes. But there's a power dynamic that changes and shifts when she realizes that he's actually a very wealthy and accomplished director. But based on all of this, there's this sort of French farce style that kind of emerges as well when we recognize that Sullivan's got a phony marriage for tax purposes thrown in there. So it's just incredibly ambitious. He's just packing all kinds of stuff into this film. I'm not done with the genres, folks. That also returns to a silent drama at one point, in which we see the soup kitchens and the encampments depicted. I didn't count how long the sequences are, but they're quite lengthy for the film, in which the camera just rolling over faces. And so I believe, in my mind, even though this sort of predates cinema verite or even neorealism, which would emerge in Italy in the late 40s, to me, he's starting to tap into that. If you look at this still that I captured of these, men out of work that are jumping onto the train, this is almost a documentary style cinema verite. Obviously, there's even film noir elements that emerge later on. We see when Sullivan is passing out the $5 bills and it's being followed and traced. Film noir was a fairly new film convention at this point in film style. It's 1941, right? So you see the close-ups of the feet following along. It's almost like Sturges was just so enthusiastic to sample and try everything out in this movie. I might mention that something that comes to my mind is when I see the scenes of the encampments, they're very reminiscent of this photograph by Dorothea Lange, who, her photos of migrants and homeless and downtrodden people throughout the 30s during the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma. This all comes to mind. And as we see these montages of the poor and the needy and the situation the population was actually living in, Sullivan's Travels actually, despite not wanting to become a message movie, becomes a message movie. This is my opinion, and it's not an original opinion. I mean, many others have thought the same thing, that despite the fact that he's kind of ribbing his colleagues for making these overt message films that are often quite manipulative. I think Grapes of Wrath is a fantastic movie, but there are times where, it's filmed in a way that's trying to pull at the heartstrings, right? But in this case, what I love about this is that Sturges just puts the camera there, shows us some faces, shows people kind of doing some things. I mean, even in the soup kitchen, you have the gentleman without the teeth, and he's kind of just enjoying his meal while we have the film director who's playing the role of the tramp. I think he even says at one point, "Hey, let's just sit here and be, pretend to be tramps or play the role of tramps." This guy that they're sitting across from, and they're obviously not digging this food, and they're not really cutting this hard life that they thought that they would be, noble about. This man it's not played for comedy, but it is what it is, basically. And so I think he's just letting you sit there and observe, and he does enough of this and purposefully draws it out long enough that it allows you to contemplate things, allows you to think about, I wonder what it's like in a real soup kitchen. I don't know about you guys, but when I was watching the scene where they're kind of, crushed in and they're sleeping in that shelter, I could, there were smells in my head. There was a sense of claustrophobia. And in my mind, to me, I don't mean this to diminish people that actually have to experience this, but for very, very minuscule aspect, one could, at least in a very, again, very minor way, imagine how horrible and challenging it must be for people to actually be in those environments. And so, and then, he cuts back to comedy, and Sullivan gets his shoes lifted, and it's just how it kind of tends to proceed. So I do tend to think that this movie does start to trend more and more toward um, the the message picture. Now, finally, of course, he gets convicted, and that's another genre of film, or film genre is the prison picture, the chain gang picture of the period. In fact, the U.S. government, because by the time this came out, they were already going to war. They said, this is not the kind of thing we want to show people right now. We need to build morale. We don't want to knock people down and show the fact that we've got lots of poverty-stricken people in our communities. So they were very much against depicting that in the films. But as we keep in mind the following sequence that you see displayed here on the screen, when Sullivan and his fellow convicts are ushered into a church to watch the picture shows, there's a pastor of an entirely Black congregation. And in my mind, if you think about all the characters in the film, this guy is one of the few people in the film who feels like a real person. He acts with compassion, and he advises his congregation that they're about to welcome some people into the church that we shouldn't judge. He uses the expression, about don't basically. I'm so sorry, I can't remember the title. The expression, it is the idea of basically not judging others, lest you be judged. So this scene actually prompted the head of the NAACP in 1941 to publicly thank Sturges and Paramount for depicting African Americans as people and not that typical caricature of the servant role that were so common in the times. And so, I think obviously Sturges was pretty progressive, and he wanted this to show that the scene in which, it's one of the more memorable in film history, it's in which people from all walks of life are coming together to forget their troubles and enjoy a laugh as they watch this Disney cartoon, Playful Pluto from 1934, for those that are counting. Just a bit of trivia, side trivia, he tried to get a Chaplin film to screen here, but Chaplin was not interested in utilizing his films to be depicted in other ones. But I just think, anyway, I really think this is kind of the key element of the film, ultimately. And the moment for me calls back the scene early in the picture when Sullivan's butler Burroughs is admonishing him about the noble charade he's about to take on. And he says things like, the poor know all about poverty and only the morbid rich would find the topic glamorous. Who's Sturges' friends? I mean, they're all people that are super rich, morbidly rich. And it's his kind of way of saying, hey, you know what? We're talking about this in the comfort of our palatial homes in Beverly Hills. The case of poverty. We're not really doing much by making these movies, conceivably. He also says, you see, sir, rich people and theorists who are usually rich people think of poverty in the negative, as the lack of riches, as disease might be called the lack of health. And so despite the message, Sturges reels us back in, and he makes sure that there's a happy ending. As a matter of fact, there's a point, and we kind of talking about the poor, we're talking about the marginalized, and Sullivan, I don't know if he ever gets it. He never really, he seems to have this moment, and yet where he truly is found trouble, and he's still thinking, I'm a film director. Film directors don't get 6 years for hard labor for hitting a guy, and he does not see the change here. And I think that's kind of the point, is that just when you think it's a message movie, nobody's changing, nobody's getting better. I think it's a slightly cynical message in the end. And Sullivan's line is, I certainly had a lot of nerve wanting to make a picture about human suffering. So anyway, it's an incredibly ambitious movie. I don't know if you thought it was funny, or at times maybe it's not a laugh out loud kind of humor, but it is all over the place. It's a lot of fun, in my mind anyway. And I say it's a movie that gets better over repeated viewings over time. Really briefly, obviously, when I think about influences, Sturges influences a lot of guys, of course, and a lot of directors and filmmakers. But of course, what's the movie he wants to make? It's called Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And of course, the Coen brothers, who I do kind of associate them with guys like Howard Hawks from last week, and guys like Preston Sturges, writer directors. And so they made a movie in 2000 called "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" set during the Depression, the Dust Bowl, and their odyssey that they go on in a most comical fashion. And if you haven't seen this, I mean, it's so much fun. It's a really great movie. So I hope you enjoyed it. I mean, I know there's so much to talk about. The film was successful to a degree. You know, it made its money back, and but it's become one of those films that's just grown in status over time, and you know, it's often on best picture lists, and anybody that's a comedic director always admires this movie a great deal. So let's have a look, and I'll just put this back on a screen that makes sense. Let's have a quick look at what you had to say. So I'm going to go ahead and go into our chat window. So many things to say, to see. Oh, Neil Miller is our executive director of the Westdale, has given me a word, by the way. For those of you that are interested, February the 12th, thanks for this, Neil. It's like I'm going to take this as a personal gift. Duck Soup, the Marx Brothers, will be playing at the theater at 1 p.m. for like $2. Holy mackerel. It's like 1933 prices, Neil. So 1 p.m., look it up, westdale.ca. Jeanette, yes, hi Jeanette. Before he became a social pariah, a few of Woody Allen's films were laugh out loud funny. Your favorite being Love and Death from 1975. And there's a guy definitely influenced by Preston Sturges. Is another person, you know, despite obviously the, you know, controversial nature, is that Allen, he became a writer director because he wanted to control things. So he made What's New Pussycat and just hated what they did with the script, and decided, no, I'm not doing that again. And I never did. And he did make some pretty fabulous films despite everything. That's another topic for conversation about artists and art down the road. Lindy, I fell in love with Veronica Lake as a young person because of the movie I Married a Witch. It's great, which was a totally delightful movie and the forerunner of the TV show Bewitched. You got it. Kim Thompson, hello. I think I saw a nod to Metropolis as the prisoners were walking into the church. Yeah, you know, the downtrodden and that sort of march. Yeah, that's a great call out, Kim. By the way, I do want to point out when our protagonist, our lead characters, I'm just going to go back to still, when they're walking, this is a bit of an Easter egg if anyone's looking. I dare you to go back and watch the scene and see if you can see a pair of legs hanging from the tree. I don't know whether that was intentional and just another way of Sturges saying, this is all artificial, folks, or whether they just missed it and it was a crew member, maybe a lighting guy or a sound guy. I'm not sure, but you can see a pair of legs hanging from a tree if you look. Hi, Linda, and I'm so glad to see you here again. I'm glad you're enjoying the talks. And thanks, Chris and Mitchell. I get lots of laughs from an early Sturges work. Christmas in July. Yes, you are correct. All of those were his own screenplay. Occasionally he adapted some ideas, like The Lady Eve was from a short story, but that was all his. He kind of tore it apart and turned it into his own thing. Gene Mayo, I disagree about Modern Times. It's not a comedy, but a very accurate comment on working conditions. Well, it was definitely and this is why Fred put it on the Movies That Mattered. It was this idea that they wanted to look at the conditions of people working in that kind of industry. You know, certainly Ford comes to mind, and sort of, you know, the fact that there were no days off, etc. So, though I think, you know, it's a bit of a satire at times, and certainly it was certainly comedic, and a comedic way to tell it. But isn't that a great way to get people to see things differently? Is when you can utilize and integrate comedy, you know, win hearts and minds that way, in my mind. Let's see. Going back to some of your comments, something I had asked about just for your insights about what your influences were and what things you loved. And I get from our good friend Jeffrey Eden here, Duck Soup. And definitely, Jeff, I don't know if you're going to come up to Hamilton, but let me know if you're coming up on the 12th for Duck Soup. It would be great to see you in person. Mr. Barry Bender, Dick Van Dyke, Gene Wilder, and SCTV. Gene Wilder, the king of the slow burn, one of my favorites. And from Young Frankenstein, I still, when I am totally stressed out about a topic or a situation, or I don't understand and it's just ridiculous, I still say his line from Young Frankenstein, sedative. And yes, I do scream it on mute here in our Zoom world. Sheldon McGregor, I thought the faces and gnarly characters in black and white were striking. In the soup kitchen, as you discussed the caretaken, but also the hobo camp near the railway. Yeah, the hobo camp when they're panning by and you see all those faces coming to the train. It's really powerful stuff. I mean, to me, I often wonder, I wonder what Sturges would have been like as a documentary filmmaker. Yeah, so Sheldon asked a question earlier in the talk what my perspective was on where the film goes into silent movie mode for a lengthy portion, and I'm certainly open to other people's perspectives, but in my mind, it's very purposeful in so much that it is allowing you enough time. And when a portion of a film is that long, it's very purposeful, obviously, in the editing, to give you enough time to process, to allow you to start thinking, to let your mind wander a little bit. And maybe kind of internalize some of the things you're doing. The thing, by the way, the fact that, there's definitely music, and music can be very manipulative, but there's no dialogue during those periods. So that's an opportunity for you to really think about what might be going on in the lives of some of those people. At least it did for me, Sheldon. Back to Jeffrey. Is this really a comedy? While they don't use the term poverty porn, the concept was there. Are there any filmic antecedents for this concept? Well, I would have to contemplate that question a little bit, but is it really a comedy? I tend to think about guys like Armando Iannucci who go really dark. If you've not seen the movie The Death of Stalin, for instance, his product, he did Veep, the HBO series with Julia Louis-Dreyfus, that predicted Trumpism, if you can imagine. Are they comedies? I mean, I think definitely it's a dark comedy in my mind. It's this sort of, there's a point where he's played hobo enough where it's finally, he says to Veronica Lake, all right, we're done. I think we've done enough. And then he, has this sort of self-righteous idea of going back out into the public with these $5 bills and handing them out. I think he's really driving the point home with a stake to the heart of the people that he's, given a hard time to. But I don't know about the term poverty porn until now, Jeffrey, so I'll have to think about any of the previous antecedents. If anyone has any knowledge, I know we've got a lot of film history buffs here, please put it in the chat window. To G. Swartz's question, were the scenes in the soup kitchen and with the tramps jumping the freight trains made with actors or with real people? Please, if anyone knows, I did an awful lot of digging around to try to find that out. And I can't help but think that they were, predating neorealism and finding real people to employ in some of these roles. And so, I think there's one of the individuals on the train who, unless it's makeup, I mean, he looked like he, had been, he'd had a tough life. Many of those faces that were cast absolutely looked like they had, really challenging times, but it could be Hollywood magic. I mean, during the studio system, they had casts of hundreds and had an awful lot of people that they could use. But I can't help but think that, to G. Swartz, if anyone can help find the answer to that. Hey, Margarita, some funny movies that is remembered are Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. That's a perennial favorite of mine. I absolutely love it. And I love that the Bela Lugosi plays it straight throughout the entire film. And Caroline, yes, for a lot of times I've seen the movie many times about the different genres, and I mean, it was only in recent years that I recognized, holy mackerel, he's basically using the medium of film and the studio system for him to experiment. And I can't help but think that, was he going to branch out? I mean, he did do Westerns. He did a Western. He's, I did, short of doing musicals, I mean, I don't know. Film noir by Preston Sturges would have been, I think, a lot of fun. So, all right, gang. Well, thank you so much, very much for coming out. Very much appreciate that. I do want to just point out one other thing, and that is next week, this time, Fred's going to be back to join us, and we are doing the classic Dr. Strangelove. or When I Stopped Worrying and Learned to Love the Bomb, with Peter Sellers in three roles. The amazing Stanley Kubrick, and just looking forward to hearing what Fred's notes are on this one, with his perspectives on this particular film, and I'll be back to make sure I do you justice in screening your Q&As. So a big thanks to everybody for joining tonight, and I hope to see you all at the Westdale very soon. There's lots going on there. So anyway, be safe and have a good night, everybody. Take care.